Welcome back to the Becoming a Teacher pod. I'm your host, Carson Amstutz. This is my second episode of my biojourn podcast project. This is being done in the teacher learning community, part of the education program at St. Louis University. Last episode, I discussed the first guiding question for this biojourn project as a whole, which was what do I know and believe about myself, my students, their families, and their communities in the larger social context. For this episode, we'll be tackling the second guiding question, which is how do I act on these beliefs, the beliefs specifically talked about in the first part, to create inclusive and responsive learning opportunities and to transform inequities. And so throughout this podcast, we'll look at some of my beliefs and how I feel practically they'll show up in the classroom, along with some other learnings that I've gathered throughout my time in St. Louis's education program. So, roll the intro. When I first looked at this guiding question, I was like, what should I write in my script? What do I want to talk about in this podcast? I had a hard time identifying what that really meant. It's like, how do I act on these beliefs? I've never been in a classroom. I've looked through some classrooms, but I've never taught a class. I've only ever been a student. I've sat in a class as an observer, which I've been really grateful for those observing times, but I've never really had the chance to make my own schedule or make my own program and have to tackle these in my own way. And so I think a lot of it comes, a lot of my beliefs in this area come from my beliefs as a whole. And I have a lot of strong beliefs on how education should be done. I believe the system is really messed up. And so I wanted to kind of specifically focus on a lot of the challenges that you'll have to face and how I want to tackle those challenges. And so to start, I think that in order to create that inclusive and responsive learning environment and transform inequities, you have to start on an individual basis. There needs to be that individual student to teacher connection, because without that, you lose out on so much of what works best for the student, and you're essentially making your job harder. That individual connection between student and teacher helps the teacher understand how does the student work best? What am I doing that will help them succeed? What am I doing that will hurt them? And it lets the student know that their needs are being cared for, and it gives them a stronger desire to work hard. And so I think in that, one of my beliefs I mentioned was that all students have strengths that they need to be used and worked towards. And I think that's a big part of that individual focus, the individual student focus, is that you need to work with the strengths of students. If a student is really good at math and struggles with English, why are you forcing this English them to learn in like an English minded way? Why don't you use their math to teach English? And so in that, you're using their strengths to pursue learning in other ways, and you're avoiding weaknesses. And I don't think that students should be taught to ignore what they're bad at and not work to improve that. But I think they need to be taught that they should use their strengths to accomplish other tasks. And in similar ways, in a more practical way, I also think a teacher needs to work with teachers and parents to identify those strengths in the first place. So for me, if I was a teacher, I have little Jimmy or whoever, it doesn't really matter, who is really struggling in my class. And I'm like, why? What am I doing wrong that is causing him to struggle? Because in my belief, a student won't continue to struggle on their own. They'll find it out on their own. If a student continues to struggle, that's the teacher's responsibility. That's their fault. And so if he's struggling, he continues to struggle. We've changed methods and it doesn't work. I think it's important to kind of understand what am I doing differently from this ex teacher that is causing that student to struggle? What am I doing differently and what are they doing better? And so there's that communication between other teachers and even their parents saying, what strategies have worked for you? What are you using? How is it helping them succeed? And so working with parents and students and teachers to identify those strengths to use is highly important. And then I think moving past that individual focus, I also think there needs to be an emphasis on creating a safe space
a safe learning environment. I think that, that the community and the environment a student walks into in a classroom is vital in breaking down inequities and creating a responsive and inclusive learning environment. I think there's a couple ways you can do this, and a couple things that you need to do. I think you have to create an environment that allows students to be themselves. If you can, so like more practically, if you can limit bullying and call out that behavior, if you can provide students with inclusive and representative material and representation in your classroom, they'll feel more comfortable in being themselves in that environment. And in that, it allows them to succeed because, as I mentioned before, it allows them to use those strengths and feel confident in themselves. And not only will it let them succeed in the classroom, but it also build that self-esteem, which is so vital, and it's, in my opinion, is more important than what they learn in the classroom or how well they can divide 12 with 4. you know I think that self-esteem building is what teachers need to be doing. And I think in that, I also think teachers must minimize the fear of failure. I think one of the biggest problems with public education and the way the education system works in the US is that the right answer is what matters. It's not the way the student learns. And so students are taught to find the right answer and not find any other answer, and they're afraid to get it wrong. And in that, they're afraid to risk take, they're afraid to look outside the box, and that is so reductive. It takes away from learning, and it produces worse answers to begin with, because the right answer isn't always the right answer. In that, there may be a better answer past the right answer that hasn't been discovered yet, but we're never going to get there if we stick to the current right answer. And so in that, I think school should be for learning, for growth, and for play, and not for getting the right answer. I think the right answer doesn't matter as much as if learning is occurring. If a student gets an answer wrong at first, that shouldn't be taken away from them, because what if they get it right the next time they do it, and then the next time, and then the next time? That's demonstrated learning. It's demonstrated they know the material now. And so it shouldn't matter whether they got it right or wrong the first time, because they've learned. And I think similar for that, students should be encouraged to risk take. They should be taught getting answers wrong doesn't mean failure. It means, what do we it means kind of a reflection. It means, what do we do wrong? And it means learning. And while obviously that's a gradual process with students working at their own pace, I think it's vital that that's taught, and that it's understood that this is a safe space to make mistakes, and that mistakes are good things, not bad things. And so I think similarly to that, kind of moving on from safe space, you also need to make an accommodating environment. You have to recognize the environment you're working in. So that comes from the systems and the context surrounding where you work. And so if I'm working in an affluent area, I have to recognize that there may be things these students haven't had to experience that other students have. And if I'm working in an area where that typically struggles socioeconomically, and these students have had lack of opportunities, you have to be aware of that, and you have to be aware of how that's affecting their learning. And so in that, you have to have access to essential resources. I think this is one of my key beliefs now, which I hadn't thought about before because of my privilege and my how I'd risen and grown, is that I took advantage for essential resources. I took advantage for clean clothes. I took advantage of food. I took advantage of having the ability to brush my teeth. And not all students have that. And I think, like, using Maslow's theory, students need their basic needs met to do well and to learn. You're not going to learn if you're thinking about where your next meal is coming from, if you're embarrassed because you feel dirty, if you think you smell bad. You're not going to learn that way. And so I think teachers should have access to essential materials. They should have toothbrush and toothpaste available. They should have clean clothes. They should have food. And I think, well, obviously that's difficult because you don't get paid very much as a teacher, and that's very limiting. I think that that is super important in creating an inclusive environment where everyone has equal chance to succeed. Then I think, kind of building on that, you got to recognize you can't do everything. I have this intense desire to change the system. I want it to I want it to fix. And, like, I've told this to people before, but I think if I made a TED talk about the school system, I'd call it, "The school system needs to be changed." But everybody already knows that anyway, because I think there's this recognition of how broken the system is, and how limiting it is, and how uninclusive it is, and how and how it just doesn't work right now in its current state. And I just want to change that so bad. I have so much passion to change that. But I have to recognize that as a teacher, I won't be able to do everything. And for the most part, I won't be able to do very much for the system. So you have to recognize that it's a slow moving system, it's not super fluid, and that I need to use the methods I can in the moment to change, and I don't need to give up because things aren't happening immediately. I need to recognize that things won't happen immediately. It's not how it works, but I can do my part to change the system. I can build an inclusive classroom. I can improve representation, which I think is a huge problem. I can, petition. I can try to change the system from a large scale, but if I want to make an impact, you have to start small and you have to start with the kids that you're working with. And so, like for example, I have deep beliefs that grading systems are messed up, but that doesn't mean that just because the system's messed up doesn't mean that I can't change it. So, for example, I have a friend. He's actually a teammate of mine on the track team, but he also works at a high school. And I love the way he grades. It's the first time I'd ever heard of something like this. And I think it's super, super fascinating and also a really good example of how to grade in a less reductive way. He grades from 0 to 100, which I think I never considered the fact that you graded from 100 to not to zero. You lose points, you don't gain points. But how he does it is you gain. And so he teaches algebra 1. And if you can prove to him that you can do a certain algebra concept, you get those points for the year. You've learned. Go focus on what you're not doing well on. And if, let's say, you're doing factoring and you're really struggling with factoring and it's just not working, in the first test you do really poorly, you bomb it. A lot of the cases in the way grading is done now, that's it for the year. You've messed up that part. You lose those points. You go from 100 to a 98 or whatever, 100 to a 93, and then you keep going down instead of up. And that doesn't teach you to learn. It doesn't teach you to risk take. It teaches you to get the right answer. And so how he does it is, if you mess it up, that's fine. Go do the homework if you want to. You should if you mess it up, probably, because it'll help you learn. But come back to me the next test and prove that you can do it, and you'll get those points. And because you've proved to me you've learned. And I think that's just one way you can challenge, you can fight the system without having to make fundamental changes. And I'd like to make fundamental changes, but I recognize that right now I can't make those changes yet. And yeah, I think that's how I would answer that second guiding question. I think those are kind of some concrete methods I'd use to create inclusive and responsive learning and opportunities. And I think my biggest takeaway from this guiding question is that I don't I haven't had passion is really important, and I think that's what I have right now. And right now, my focus in reflection is I want to turn that passion into a concentration, into a focus, and really find ways to change the system in my own classroom first. And then maybe later go work and try to change the system through legislature, through laws. But right now, I want to just start with the classroom. And so that's how I would answer that second guiding question. So hopefully you enjoyed the second podcast of the Becoming a Teacher pod. I really enjoyed making this one. I feel like I'm getting more comfortable going for longer segments. So I don't have to do so much editing, which is nice. Um, and I'll see you next time with the third guiding question.